2018, Independence Day. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff the Dissident Peasant. On today's show, Thomas Paine, revolutionary thinker, two continents. My favorite founding father. We're going to celebrate him and tell you a little about the life and times of Thomas Paine on today's Independence Day. Before I get to that, I just want to tell you that today's show is, of course, sponsored by people like you. You can go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. You can support my show. It's the easiest way to let me know that my work is gratifying to some people. If you don't have any money, hit me up on Twitter. Tell me I'm awesome. At Jeff His Studentist. Headquarters, as always, dissidentpeasant.com. With that out of the way, on to today's show. We'll start with an early 19th century nursery rhyme. Poor Tom Paine, there he lies. Nobody laughs and nobody cries. Where he has gone or how he fares, nobody knows. Nobody cares. And poor they really meant. For centuries after his death in 1809, he was remembered as an impoverished drunk, a poor substitute for the rigor of thinkers like John Locke. The state of affairs the ruling classes in America and Great Britain were more than agreeable to. Even today, he is frequently known mostly through stories in children's books and cartoons, or from the insane ramblings of paranoid conservative Glenn Beck types. In history classes in the United States, he is likely to get a nod for his common sense, something even his detractors have usually allowed him. But this is all. But he was did much more than this. There is some debate among scholars, particularly those of a more leftist persuasion, as to whether or not the founding of the United States really constituted a revolution. Basically, whether there was an American Revolution or just an American War for Independence in the late 18th century. Now, I tend to believe that a true revolution did take place, though among the political revolutions of the 18th and 19th century in France, Haiti, South America, for example, it was without question among the least radical. But Thomas Paine, that eternal nuisance to the powers that be, who just couldn't stop thinking and advocating for a more egalitarian, democratic society for the oppressed of his day, he's a big reason why I answer that question the way I do. So today we introduce the man, Thomas Paine, the man who puts the rest of the quote-unquote revolutionaries of the United States to shame, whose name is no longer mud, but not quite gold, who would suffer his entire life repeatedly for being ahead of his time, and who really did live under nearly constant threat of execution or imprisonment everywhere he published, in the United States, in France, in England. In other words, he was the real deal. Thomas Paine was born in February 1737, according to our calendar. Not begotten by a wild boar on a bitch wolf, as John Adams would have you believe, but the son of two humans, Joseph and Francis Paine, a Quaker and Anglican respectively. His mother was the daughter of a popular and prosperous lawyer in his birth home of Thetford. She was 40 when she became a mother. His father, a Quaker craftsman of more meager means. He attended primary school at an age when it was neither compulsory nor free as a boy for a few years. It may not sound like much to us, but it was important enough to the family that they borrowed to achieve it. Thetford, of course, is a quite ancient city, about 35 miles from Cambridge, founded at the confluence of the rivers Thet and Ouse. Its people today are privileged to host a statue of Paine. The soil there is not naturally fertile, and during Paine's day there were no pesticides or fertilizers or whatnot. So imagine oats and goats for the farmers, metalwork for the laborers. The enclosure movement, whose history is worth an entire episode by itself, was still in full swing at this time, and land traditionally available for public access continued to flow into private hands. Thetford residents like Paine would have seen starving thieves publicly executed regularly. In fact, with only 2 public holidays, Easter and Christmas, at this time in England, public executions were one of the few forms of popular entertainment. They were a public holiday. Justice, as defined by the conventional wisdom of the time, often required brutal executions. Hundreds of crimes carried a death sentence. But this was also the age of the branding iron, the ducking stool, and the exile, not just the noose and the blade. His religious education was mixed. He was baptized and confirmed in the Church of England, but he would also go with his father to Quaker meetings, and in the battle between Anglicanism and Quakerism, in the mind of young Thomas, both would end up losing. He himself would remember a clarifying moment as a child, and recounted it as follows, quote, "I well remember, when about 7 or 8 years of age, hearing a sermon read by a relation of mine, who was a great devotee of the church, upon the subject of what is called redemption by the death of the Son of God. After the sermon was ended, I went into the garden, and as I was going down the garden steps, for I perfectly recollect the spot, I revolted at the recollection of what I had heard, and thought to myself that it was making God Almighty act like a passionate man that killed his son when he could not revenge himself any other way. And as I was sure a man would be hanged that did such a thing, I could not see for what purpose they preached such sermons. This was not one of those kinds of thoughts that had anything of it of childish levity. It was to me a serious reflection, arising from the idea that God was too good to do such an action, and also too almighty to be under any necessity of doing it. I believe in the same to this moment, and I moreover believe that any system of religion that has anything in it that shocks the mind of a child cannot be a true system." End quote. When grammar school was up around the age of 12 and no other options available, his parents apprenticed him to his father in stay making, a type of rigid garment designed to give English women of a certain status at the time the hourglassed figure that was in fashion. These were like working class VCR repairmen of their day. Basically a decent but precarious wage, as these bills were the first to go unpaid during economic slumps, and fashion itself a flighty thing in times good and bad. So when the 7 Years' War erupted in 1756, an almost 20, Thomas Paine went down to the docks to sign up as a privateer aboard the Terrible, captained by William Death. Really. His father talked him out of it, for which a great many people owe him a debt for almost certainly saving Thomas Paine's life. The Terrible was destined to be assaulted by a French ship immediately upon entering the English Channel, and only 17 of its crew would survive. The next winter, however, young Thomas signed on with the King of Prussia, a ship that went on to capture 8 ships in as many months, and which netted him something like £30 in commission, or around $5,000 today. He entered London in glory, he fell in love with the city, and he upgraded his wardrobe. Silk stockings, linen shirts, silver buckles on his shoes, a decent hat. He luckily avoided the white lead of the time that served as cosmetic, and never really aspired to the fashions of the aristocracy regardless of his location. He also bought some globes, and learned some philosophy and astronomy from some fellows of the Royal Society. London in 1757 was then a city of perhaps 650,000, undergoing profound changes in culture, and changes resulting from the birth of science itself, with a burgeoning economic class of merchants, craftsmen, inventors, and mechanics. and clubs forming of brow, both high and low, on everything from astronomy to zoology, occupying new coffee houses, lecture halls, societies of letters, but all in the shadow of the monarchs from the House of Hanover. In the political and social hierarchy of the time, Thomas Paine and his lot were a bare step above servants or housemaids. His father, Joseph Paine, wrote no treatises, nor inspired any revolutions, but he did feed and clothe his family for his entire life, and so achieved more than most craftsmen of his day. His son Thomas would not be so lucky. He left London for Dover in 1758 for work as a journeyman staymaker. He eventually took out a loan to start his own staymaking business and fell in love with Mary Lambert. They wed on September 27th, 1759. Almost immediately after, his business collapsed, and they conceived a child. So, fleeing his creditors and moving for the health of his wife, the Paines skipped town. Mary went into an early labor. Neither she nor the child survived. Thomas Paine was widowed at 23, broke. In all his visionary proposals of what we call welfare state today, he always included financial support for young adults leaving home for the first time. So he moved back in with his parents and began to endeavor to enter the ranks of the excise, basically to become a tax collector for the government on goods like coffee, tea, chocolate, and alcohol. The job was dangerous, it was poorly paid, and difficult to obtain. Though massive quantities of people viewed as disposable at the time created the conditions that allowed such jobs to exist. But having been confirmed in the Church of England, and having a decently important maternal grandfather, he was allowed the opportunity to take the exam, which he passed in 1762 at 25. After less than a year on the job, though, Thomas Paine was probably scapegoated for the corrupt practices of his superior when he was accused of taking a shopkeeper at his word instead of assessing tax directly. This is the kind of thing that happened everywhere all the time among poorly salaried tax collectors. He did a bit of stay-making before giving London another crack, but the only work he could find was school teaching, an even worse-paying gig than taxman. He wrote a letter begging to be rehired by the excise, and his request was granted in February 1768. He was posted to Lewes, a few miles from Brighton, near the southeast coast of England, about 80 miles from Calais, popular with Dutch smugglers and French imports, where he would live the next 6 years. He joined the Headstrong Club, which met regularly to eat and argue about local and national affairs. This is where Paine nurtured a love for argument, erudition, wit, rhetoric. This is where his earliest surviving remarks upon politics occur. In 1773, when some town patriarch remarked that Prussia's Frederick the Great was, quote, the right sort of man to be king, for he has a deal of the devil in him, end quote. Paine wondered if, quote, a system of government could not exist that did not require the devil, end quote. He lived in the spare room of a Samuel Olive above a store that sold tobacco, snuff, and groceries. Much product Paine himself was in charge of assessing tax on. The two men grew so close that when Samuel died in 1769, Paine himself stepped in during his off-duty hours to help out the widow Olive to try and run the store, although he did move out of their house first. And in 1771, he married the dead Samuel's only daughter, 24-year-old Elizabeth, though the marriage was never consummated and their union was legally separated in 1774, for which Thomas Paine received either 45 or 35 pounds in cash, I have seen both, for a promise never to slander and defame his wife, but letting his wife retain all other property at a time when this was not at all the norm. Paine never explained why he did this, and it's very possible that the marriage was seen as a business arrangement by all parties involved from the very start. But what is certain is that this money was the money that literally bought his ticket to America. So far as is known, Thomas Paine would seek no other romantic or sexual relationships for the rest of his life, and neither he nor Elizabeth would ever remarry or seek formal divorce. In later years, he would anonymously send his legal wife money when he heard of their hard times, and when the British government approached Elizabeth with the opportunity to make some quick cash by helping the British government trash her husband, she refused. Now, in addition to his work as a taxman, there is one final act I need to tell you about that took place in Lewis for Thomas Paine, and that is Paine's first foray into politics. You see, excise officers throughout the kingdom had begun to reach consensus in 1772 about the need to present a petition to the government, making a case that their salaries needed to be increased, that their working conditions were intolerable. And not just in Lewis, but throughout the ranks of the Crown's excise, Thomas Paine had developed a bit of a reputation as a man of talent and eloquence and some learning. So it fell to him to draft the petition. It's pretty good. It's really good when you consider it as a first effort. One of its best lines, in my opinion, brilliantly illustrates how the desperate and precarious lack the ability to truly choose to live within the law. Quote, "Poverty, in defiance of principle, begets a degree of meanness that will stoop to almost anything. He who never was hungered may argue finely on the subject of his appetite, and he who never was distressed may harangue beautifully on the power of principle. But poverty, like grief, has an incurable deafness which never hears. The oration loses all its edge, and to be or not to be becomes the only question." End quote. Each excised man contributed a few shillings. 4,000 copies of this were printed, and they all paid to send Paine to London. During this trip, he makes a few more friends in high places, including Oliver Goldsmith, the playwright and man of letters. He would become a lifelong Paine friend. George Lewis Scott, a member of the Excise Board who met Paine the last time he was in London and encouraged his petition to the government, introduced Paine to, among others, the legendary historian Edward Gibbon, author Samuel Johnson, and another chap I'll return to momentarily. The government kept him waiting for 2 years, during which Paine had to take what work he could, and his business with Elizabeth and the widow Olive was collapsing. When they finally responded, it was in a manner that left no doubt as to how ahead of their time they were, these proto-trade unionists of the excise. The answer was no. Also, "Mr. Paine, you've been away from your post for 2 years now, so you're fired. Also, Mr. Paine, because you are now unemployed, you are immediately liable for arrest for your debts." Ouch. His stuff was auctioned off. He separated from his wife, took that money I mentioned before for his ticket to the New World, and went off to London to meet with that other chap that I mentioned earlier, someone you may have heard of once or twice, inventor, political philosopher, businessman, diplomat, arch Enlightenment figure, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin lost one son to smallpox and another to the British during the American Revolution, and later in life, Benjamin Franklin would call Thomas Paine son. During this meeting, he urged him to take his talents to America, where they might bear more fruit. They will maintain a lifelong relationship. Paine will correspond with Franklin on almost anything and everything he thinks about. They were much alike, actually. Both born into low rungs of society, both staunch Republicans, both anti-slavery, and Benjamin Franklin, it should be said, as a young man, argumentative and vitriolic, uncompromising and zealous, all traits Thomas Paine shared with him. In his later years, of course, Ben Franklin becomes more reserved, restrained, diplomatic, a businessman, and a deal maker. Thomas Paine never learns these qualities. Thomas Paine becomes the youthful energy of Benjamin Franklin unleashed, except it persists his entire life. So, armed with nothing but his education with the Newtonians and Enlightenment figures of London, and a catch of letters from Benjamin Franklin, one of which read, quote, "The bearer, Mr. Thomas Paine, is very well recommended to me as an ingenious, worthy young man. He goes to Pennsylvania with a view of settling there. If you can put him in a way of obtaining employment as a clerk or assistant tutor in a school or assistant surveyor, of all of which I think him very capable, so that he may procure a subsistence at least till he can make acquaintance and obtain a knowledge of the country, you will do well, and much oblige your affectionate father." And so it is that in December of 1774, Thomas Paine, wrapped in a blanket and wretched with typhus after a 6-week-long journey across the Atlantic, was literally carried onto the docks of Philadelphia. Neither typhus nor the woeful state of modern medicine at the time would kill Thomas Paine in 1774. And next time, Thomas Paine will have recovered and will recount how he became, among a great many other things, the author of the greatest selling work in American history, Common